So we're going to get started now.
Okay.
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum to all the viewers and others who are going to watch this later. Today we're going to have our episode 4 of Look For Us in the Storm, the Successors of Malcolm X series. Today's session is with guest panelist Ward Churchill, who came to Milestones before, who also republished his piece, The Ghost of 9/11, for which he wrote a new preface for Milestones a couple of years ago. So we want to welcome Ward, and I have with me my co-host, Hanbal Shakur, who is a contributing researcher for Milestones and also a political organizer. I want to quickly read a bio of Ward for those of you who are not aware of Ward's work. So Ward Churchill is a past national spokesperson for the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee and UN delegate for the International Indian Treaty Council. He's a life member of Vietnam Veterans Against the War and currently a member of the Council of Elders of the original Rainbow Coalition, founded by the Chicago Black Panther leader, Fred Hampton, in 1969. Now retired, Churchill was professor of American Indian Studies and chair of the Department of Ethnic Studies until 2005, when he became the focus of a major academic freedom case. Among his 24 books are the award-winning Agents of Repression, Fantasies of the Master Race, Struggles for the Land, On the Justice of Roosting Chickens, as well as the COINTELPRO papers, which is what we're going to discuss today, A Little Matter of Genocide, Acts of Rebellion, and Kill the Indian, Save the Man. So welcome, Ward, to our roundtable.
Oh, thank you. Pleased to be here.
I want to start off by just asking you to kind of contextualize the political climate under which the COINTELPRO developed as a program, and then sort of give us some understanding of the methods and techniques used by that program, the government program of repression.
Okay, well, COINTELPRO, which is actually it's a cryptonym rather than an acronym because it was a secret program. Mm-hmm. As such, in a formal sense, when they used that caption in their internal documents, it originates in 1956. Mm-hmm. So it's coming at the tail end of so-called McCarthy period. McCarthy himself has been censored by the Senate, and that particular line of attack had been essentially nullified, and this secret program kicks in to continue initially operations to destabilize and destroy the Communist Party USA. Mm-hmm. Continues under that caption until 1971, when a citizen's burglary of an FBI resident agency in Media, Pennsylvania reveals the fact of its existence. Mm-hmm. J. Edgar Hoover, who was the lifetime director at that point still, became that in 1924 and had been working in the Bureau since 1919, and arguably since 1917 had been in charge of counter-radical activities for the Justice Department. Mm. Ordered the discontinuation of the caption, not of the operations. They were redesignated. And on the front end of that, I said, you know, the incept date, as they would call it, would be 1956. The methods that were being used and the kinds of targets taken could be dated back as far as the Bureau. And in fact, you can date it back further than that, at least in certain main lines of tactic and targeting, to the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which was contracted in the aftermath of the Civil War. Third back in the 1860s, it was contracted by the newly formed Justice Department to fulfill the investigative functions of the department. So you had this private sector stuff. Reaganites out there should resonate with this, you know. The investigative activities of the Justice Department were privately contracted. And so you had targets that were taken, such as the Molly Maguires up in the, which was a radical labor entity, Irish mostly, in the Pennsylvania coal fields. And the Western Federation of Miners, a few years after that. the Reno gang, so-called in southern Indiana, Jesse James, and we know what the solution to the Jesse James problem was. They paid a guy to shoot him in the back of the head at his house. These sorts of tactics and targets have been there, you could say, at least as long as the Justice Department or the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Now, the Bureau was formed against the will of Congress, an interim gesture, under Attorney General Bonaparte, who, yes, was a direct lineal descendant of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1908, I believe it was, and took as one of its first targets Jack Johnson, the world heavyweight champion, whose main offense was that he was black and not particularly ashamed of that fact, you could say. All right. So he was setting a really, really bad example for white supremacist power structure. So a couple things emerge. One is that this whole line of action, which is arguably the principal line of action, is taken out of this entity, which, whether it's a Pinkerton agency or the Bureau of Investigation, as it was originally called, or the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as it becomes known in 1934. The principal line of action has always been to maintain the status quo, business as usual, maintain the interests of, well, in that formative period of the Bureau itself, in the early 20th century, the plutocracy that was in place at the time. And that maintains not only through the COINTELPRO era, but into the present moment, okay, maintaining the present plutocracy. And it has to do with essentially suppressing any kind of serious dissent. By serious, I mean effective, capable of galvanizing people into action in their own self-interest. And when I say people, I mean the people, the broad mass of people. For them to be galvanized in action of their own self-interest is detrimental to the stability of the status quo. It affects change. That's what the FBI is there to prevent. That's what COINTELPRO on the sharp end of things is there most specifically to prevent. And in doing that, use the entire inventory of tactics that are allowable. It's an extra constitutional domain. They're allowable. They're for use against agents of foreign powers, more specifically espionage agents, saboteurs, and such as that. And you don't measure success in that area. And I'm paraphrasing an FBI official at this point. You do not measure success in that area by bringing indictments and successful prosecutions. Any means by which you neutralize the organization or individual or individuals, whether they're fully organized or not, you organize or you take action to neutralize. That's their term, neutralize, in the particular activities that cause them to be targeted. And that can go anything from, the most common is rumor mongering, seeking to discredit them within their own milieu, cause them to be suspect or considered disreputable by the individuals they're working with and the individuals they would be recruiting. Okay. Publicly discrediting through disinformation that's passed in the media, as well as some of the rumor mongering. There's overlap here. Okay. To pretextual arrests, targeting arrests on petty offenses, not necessarily with intent to obtain a conviction, but just tie them up in legal process and cause them to expend resources that could otherwise be utilized for political organizing, for dissemination of information, for the sorts of things that political organizations or political activists do. Their money's being expended on defending themselves against spurious charges, really. this was used really effectively against the revolutionary active movement in Philadelphia in 1967. Well, they had a collaborative relationship. The FBI had a collaborative relationship under COINTELPRO with the Philadelphia Police Department. Commissioner at the time was a guy by the name of Frank Rizzo, who's kind of notorious for this sort of thing. And in the documents describing proposing the program in the first place that they carry out during the summer is that they will arrest every known RAM activist on every conceivable charge, spitting on the sidewalk, jaywalking, it didn't matter. Right. As fast as they would make bail to come out, they'd be arrested again on the steps of the courthouse and reincarcerated. Until, you know, they're describing people who are breaking down under that kind of pressure. You know, a guy who had just gotten home, had taken a shower, changed his clothes, and there's a knock on the door and they're arresting him again and talking about him, you know, just breaking down and crying, you know, basically kicking his furniture and stuff. He's so frustrated, you know, and the outcome of that, they said, was a very effective neutralization. RAM was dysfunctional during that period of time. And members, you know, new members and recruits were deterred, obviously. They weren't signing up for this. And new members, junior members and stuff were heading for the doors. You find that phenomenon later with the Black Panther Party for more intense reasons. They're killing them as well as incarcerating them in false arrests and all the rest of it.
Right.
You know, and setting them at odds with one another. You have people pulling out of the party in droves under those conditions, and that's a successful operation. Ratchet up another level and you get outright frame-ups. Geronimo Pratt, and there's a number of others. But Pratt, you know, was 300 miles away from the crime they said he committed, killing his school teacher in a small-time robbery on a tennis court in Santa Monica, California, when they knew full well they had electronic surveillance and physical surveillance, knew he was in the Bay Area.
Wow.
At a central committee meeting at the Black Panther Party and covered that up. They never did release the June logs, as they're called, which are the, you know, the logs, the records of the electronic surveillance. They claimed that they lost those records for a single 2-week period of time, which would have included, you know, the exculpatory evidence on Pratt. If you can railroad someone in prison for any charge, you know, in his case, they literally sat down with a stack of unsolved murder files and picked one that looked like it would fit the program pretty well and charged him with that. Excuse me. You have another layer of fomenting discord, well, within groups.
Yes.
Okay, so you infiltrating provocateurs to disrupt, raising stupid points and fomenting arguments between group members and so forth, set the group at odds within itself, but also using provocateurs, often in both organizations, to start disputes between organizations. Again, in LA, there's a good example of the Panthers and Us, where an agent by the name, he was a young guy, he was a young Turk at the time, coming Squad 2, which was the Panther desk of the COINTELPRO section, and the LA field office of the FBI. So they were working Panthers. His idea, which he proposed, and it was accepted by headquarters, which means Hoover and Bill Sullivan, the people who were running the bureau at that time. Sullivan's area had to do with counterintelligence, domestic intelligence, but big time counterintelligence kind of stuff. Okay. Because to be published, in other words, they sat down and did cartoons mimicking the style of Emory Douglas and the style of the guy who was doing graphics for Us, so that Panthers seemed to be really viciously ridiculing Karinga in particular. Lane, as you know now. It was Ron Carriga at the time. And vice versa, cartoons that were being distributed on the street in the name of the US organization, ridiculing the Panther leadership at the time, the Panther idea in general. So they're creating this kind of intergroup hostility in the expectation, he said, these are both violence-prone groups. Okay, so if we can exacerbate hostilities and tensions between them, you know, this could have some really beneficial results. Well, Huggins and Bunchy Carter being the head of he was a real key member. He and a lieutenant by the name of John Huggins were recruiting or trying to really bring the US organization, supposedly stands for United Slaves. In any case, they were doing the same thing. So you have a classroom at Campbell Hall on UCLA campus where 4 members of us shot Carter and Huggins to death. And then according to one former FBI infiltrator, a high-level provocateur, were picked up behind the building by 2 agents that he named. And I'm sorry, off the top of my head, the names of the agents escape me at the moment, but in any event, the Steiners were nabbed. Okay. And they were convicted of murder by an LA jury and sent to prison. One day they just walked out of prison. This is a maximum security prison on a murder beat, and they just walked out of the prison. Disappeared. They turned up in Guyana some years later.
Wow.
The shooter, identified as a guy named Claude Hubert, was taken immediately to New Jersey, put on a plane, and sent to Suriname.
Wow.
Okay, so he was taken out of the country. And Claude Hubert was almost certainly working for the FBI, that's according to Wes Swearingen, who was, well, you'd say he was a defector from the FBI itself. I mean, he was an operational, a street agent, and he was involved in this stuff, and in the COINTELPRO section at the time. So he had firsthand knowledge of this, but he kept it to himself until he retired. So I'm not sure that's quite a defection, whatever. He was straight up that Hubert and the Steiner brothers were both working for the FBI, or all 3 of them, because there were 2 Steiner brothers.
Wow.
And you had an attempt to do that in Chicago. To bring peace stone into the Black Panther Party in Chicago, which would have doubled the size of the party nationally if that had happened. Okay. And they got a very efficient organization, but it's with street crime, but you rechannel that into community service and resistance activities. Well, this would be a potent move. But you get this anonymous letter sent by, quote, soul brother, warning Fort that Fred Hampton has a hit out on him, contract killing, which was not true, and Ford didn't buy it. He didn't respond. He was a savvy character at the time. But Marlon Johnson, who was a special agent in charge in Chicago, who had approved this particular gambit, which was carried out by an agent named Piper, I believe. Yeah. He's questioned about that in front of a grand jury. He said, well, you know, what's being talked about in this letter that the FBI trumps up and sends to warn Jeff Fort? What do you mean by hit? And Marlon Johnson says, and I sort of got this close paraphrase of, I have no idea, you know, really, what a hit might mean in the ghetto vernacular, but I would assume it's something nonviolent. So you're trying to get one group to assassinate another. And then Hampton case clearly demonstrates. You know, he and Mark Clark were assassinated by police that were working under an arrangement with the FBI. The FBI provided them with the pretext, a floor plan to the apartment, and with an X mark on it as to where Hampton would be sleeping. That was provided by an FBI infiltrator by the name of O'Neill, who was nominally, to all appearances, had slipped second barbital, so he would be in his assigned spot. And a guy by the name of Carmody with a submachine gun, part of the raiding force that kicks in door at 4 o'clock in the morning, stands and draws the line, the burst of fire all the way along the wall. Didn't even go into the roof, the first burst. Full length of Hampton's bed. It hits him in the chest. Didn't kill him. So another one of the dozen raiders that the police had sent pulls him by his wrist out of the bed on the floor, shoots him twice in the head, says, well, he's good and dead now. Okay, so you've got this continuum, and there's lots of other little methods, you know, trying to cause marital dissent and so forth. So this is really ugly inventory of tactics.
Right.
Okay, but that's part of the, you could say, the toolkit for counterintelligence, which, as I say, the FBI had a certain mandate to perform. But counterintelligence, per se, referred to the neutralization of enemy spies, espionage agents, saboteurs, agents of foreign powers that are engaged in activities detrimental to the interests of the United States inside the United States. Okay. COINTELPRO, the caption actually is the co and the intel are from counterintelligence, and pro is for program. Okay. Which is what it sounds. But the hook on this, the reason it was so secret at the time, and that's cryptonym, is because it was a domestically focused counterintelligence program. It wasn't focused targeting the agents of foreign powers, although it could be argued that the FBI had some notion that there was a KGB relation with the initial one with the CPUSA, although CP had already been destroyed, and any spy apparatus that existed within the CP hadn't existed anymore since the 1940s. But maybe they were paranoid and still thinking about that. That's the only instance in which that's true. Okay. So targeting the Black Panther Party, targeting the Revolutionary Action Movement, targeting the Socialist Workers Party, targeting Martin Luther King, and the Civil Rights Movement, targeting the Student Nonviolent and later National Coordinating Committee, targeting the Students for Democratic Societies, targeting the Young Socialists. These are all targets, and there's more. Okay, none of that had to do with agents of foreign powers. None of it had to do with any defensible belief that it might be. Okay, it was to curtail activities of citizens within the United States that would tend to destabilize the status quo, affect fundamental social change of some sort. Now, there's a range of sorts that might involve, okay, whether that was radical union activity or desegregation of housing or Black empowerment, economic empowerment, or women's liberation, which they got onto late in the game, whatever. And I'm using the vernacular of today. I understand women's liberation's kind of.
Ward, I think Hannibal had a question.
Okay.
Just to interrupt, sorry to interrupt you, but
yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, so it's in the same vein, and that's why I was kind of waiting for a minute, because you're kind of talking about it. But I wanted to, because in this series we've been talking about some of the people who came before Malcolm X who had a big influence on him, and some of the people who came after. And there's one of the things that was consistent in that tradition is that pretty much at each generation you had a major targeting of the influential people. So with regard to Marcus Garvey, we know he was targeted in a particular way. And then, you know, with Malcolm X's father, but Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey specifically were targeted in an organized fashion by the government, right? And so what I wanted to ask you is, can you talk a little bit about how they use the tactic of disruption as a way to break up sort of you know, this protracted struggle, or this, you know, multi-generational struggle, and how that kind of disruption in between the generations and how that influences you know, sort of the progress or the lack of progress, or what have you, between, you know, one generation and the next.
Okay. I'm not entirely sure I can do a bit of it. But Garvey, for starters, Hoover was doing a lot of stuff in the period that we're talking about. He picked up on the Garvey case, and I believe it was 1918 is the first documents I've seen. Okay. Well, 1918 is the year of the slacker raids in the IWW trial, and on the verge of the anti-anarchists, which is mostly at European immigrants. The Blitz, it's known as the Palmer raids, which comes out of the Wall Street bombing and some weather bombs. And that's what gets all the attention. It's spectacular. Okay, so it's due attention and so forth. There's been a lot of attention paid to what Hoover is doing in that respect, what the BOI did in that respect, what the link-ups were. Garvey is more under the radar, because Garvey had formed, first of all, he's an immigrant too, he's from Jamaica, okay? But he's a galvanic speaker and got a concept, and the concept translates organizationally into something called a United Negro Improvement Association, which is the single largest mass organization of African descended people in the history of the United States. So, you know, he's definitely under radar. But Garvey is partly back to Africa movement. Okay, he's advocating that African descended people shouldn't even bother to slug it out here. They got their own domain, and the liberation of Africa should be paramount. So you hear that from you heard it from Stokely Carmichael. Kwame Ture was a major proponent of that in the 1970s, and well, really until he died in the 90s. Okay, so there's links in continuity that go along the line there between the point we're talking about, 1918, 1920, around in there, and certainly with Stokely. Stokely was a major figure circa 1970, well, really from 65 to 70, you know. He's as visible as anybody in the Black liberation movement in the United States. Okay, Hoover himself is going to tie this together. Garvey's other main pole, and this was what was really attracting, I think, the greatest numbers of people to his organization and his vision, was Black economic self-sufficiency here, business starting, getting land, grow food, set up exchanges between Black communities and so forth, get out from under the debt tyranny and the wage tyranny of whites. So one of the things he was doing was trying to do business starts, and he was tying Africa and African Americans together with concept of what he called the Black Star Steamship Line, which he issued stock, but then used some of the money, as it turns out, used some of the money that accrued from stock sales to fund other business enterprises that he had going, because he was juggling a lot of things. So money's being sloshed back and forth. which is not unusual. If you want to look at corporate records today, you see slosh all over the place. And transfer payments, not just within the United States, but international. I'll just leave that one where it is. Okay. This is really, in a way, standard business practice.
Right.
But accounting's not necessarily copacetic from the revenuer's point of view, or you can make a case on that. Well, the 1918 document I'm talking about is Hoover saying that they conducted an intensive investigation of Garvey's activities for a period of, I don't know, 3 months or 4 months, something to that effect. And had people inside his organization. And only time in the history of the FBI up until the 1960s that you have any black agents recruited. And they were specifically to work on Garvey and Garvey's organization. They could get inside. It was a little hard. This is a blacks only organization.
Right.
It's so hard to infiltrate white agents. So
Right.
they hired. And same was true to a lesser extent, at least in terms of numbers, with an organization called the African Blood Brotherhood. Okay, it's a smaller group by far, and it was more of a cadre organization. So it's different. But I got people inside that too. Inside Garvey's organization is a guy by the name of James Wormley. All these have code numbers too, like Agent P38, such as that. Often in documents, you just find them referred to by that code number. So you sort of got to have an index of who corresponds to which number. And you got some of them that there's no name corresponding to the number, still unknown. But in any event, Wormley had wormed his way in fairly close to Garvey, so they had solid information. So Hoover's saying, we've done this intensive investigation over a period of time. And unfortunately, he uses that word, unfortunately, we've come up with no violations of criminal law. Okay, or federal law. All right. Fair
So
enough. You had, excuse me.
Yeah, if I could just briefly interrupt. So we're talking about something that's somewhat of an inquisition.
Well, yeah.
So we talked before a little bit about the Spanish Inquisition, and you know, we've made a few connections to this tradition, and we found that, you know, one of the initial issues that came up when we talk about like the birth of blackness, and we talk about the history of, you know, the Black liberation struggle and some of the people involved, there are these recurring themes, right? So in Spain with the Moors, you had the Inquisition, where, you know, the people in power start going over them with a fine-tooth comb, looking for ways to justify, to seize things from them or to persecute them in some way. And so for me, as I'm listening to you, it reminds me of that Inquisition, because essentially they're, you know, combing through this, through Garvey's organization, looking for something to use to persecute him. Yeah,
and this is where it gets interesting. I mean, you could argue in the face of the memo that I'm paraphrasing, or a couple instances quoting directly there. Up to that point, you could say, well, that's standard stuff. They had some suspicions, they investigated, they came up with nothing, case closed. No, that's the next paragraph where it gets instructive. Hoover doesn't take that as a reason to close the case. Hoover says, with continuing investigation, I'm sure we can come up with something. So they intensified the already intense investigation because they had come up with nothing, which is frustrating, and they're looking for something to bust the guy up. Okay. Now, they did. Okay, it was what I was talking about with the trend. Nobody has ever, including the FBI or J. Edgar Hoover, for that matter, nobody ever accused Marcus Garvey of taking a dime, embezzling, whatever. Okay. these were considered inappropriate. In fact, they were technically unlawful to use the money generated by sales of stock in a given enterprise to fund the activities of another enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
I got him on that kind of a technicality.
Mm.
Sentenced him to prison and sent him down here to where I'm sitting in Atlanta Federal Prison for a couple of years. And you're getting a little blowback on that. So they cut him loose from prison on an immediate deportation order.
Mm.
So at that point, he never set foot in the United States again. He was deported to Jamaica. He's an important figure in Jamaica, or the Rastafarians, among others.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Also spent some time in England because Jamaica was a British crown colony at the time. So it transit rights. But mostly Jamaica. Well, UNIA, the United Negro Improvement Organization, still exists. But, you know, once he's out of the picture, some people tried to keep it going, but it went into decline and basically had no further great effect. But there's a lesson learned. There's a couple points to be drawn from this. One, there's a lesson learned by Hoover. And he never really, until the 1960s, primarily targeted Black organizations, okay? There were other means of getting at this, okay? But once the Black Power, it starts with King in upping the ante and the priority assigned to it within the COINTELPRO context to neutralize the civil rights movement. So King is taken as a particular target, but once Stokely Carmichael makes the Black Power speech, you start to see the shift to armed self-defense and so forth way high, you know, and this is resonating with people at the time. And there's a lot of instability. There's ghetto revolts, so-called, what they call ghetto riots. That's what they call them, okay? But inner city revolts, Black community revolts in the urban context, big ones, okay? Detroit, Newark, and so on. In 66, 67, he writes a memo saying that action needed to be taken to prevent the rise of a Black Messiah. And the antecedent to that term is his view of Marcus Garvey. Garvey was dangerous because he galvanized masses of people into pursuing their own self-interest. And this is what he's trying to avert, the second coming of Garvey in the late 1960s. I mean, it's almost Freudian the way this comes out. Okay, but backing up now to Garvey, you got these infiltrators, snitches, provocateurs within the organization. And they're setting people at odds with one another in the leadership within the organization, rumor mongering, whispering, campaigns, and so on. But also, you got one, can't remember his name, but you had one agent that's working both with the African Blood Brotherhood and Garvey's organization. And that's unusual, only on the basis of the Blood Brotherhood being pretty small and insular. That's Cyril Briggs' group. But the upshot of this, he's able to convince Briggs to attack Harvey in such a way, Garvey, in such a way as to provide fodder for the Bureau of Investigation. Okay. And then I haven't really found any indication that agents were necessary, that you had provocateurs involved, though they may well have been, you know. But there is a really serious ideological clash between W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois, well, his views in those days were not the same as they evolved into later, which is not to necessarily diminish him, but he was not the radical that he later became.
Mhm.
Right.
Mhm.
Okay, time he was forming the NAACP and so forth. But that clash, which was a genuine clash, then translates into, and Du Bois didn't sign it, but a couple leaders of the NAACP, along with somebody from, I think, the Urban League, but several Black rights organizations, write directly to Hoover, demanding that Garvey be deported.
Wow. Wow.
Okay. One thing right now, sort of casting about, seeing if they provided other information to facilitate the Bureau's campaign to neutralize Garvey.
What was their rationale for that? Were they saying, you know, he's getting in the way of our work, or
Yeah, that his politics were contradictory to theirs, and of course they had the right line, you know, with civil rights and so forth, and he's essentially advocating a separatist line, so there's a conflict there. Briggs and his guys are essentially, they actually merged with the Communist Party, so they're pulling yet a third line. So you have these ideological divisions within. I just use the term Black Liberation Movement to cover it all. It's not quite accurate, but the Black Rights Movement in any case, you know. And you got personality conflicts that the Bureau and particular agents are able to play upon to create these, you know. In our own disputes and our own actions, you know, trying to discredit one another, one up one another, and, okay, sit around dancing on the dialectic for 20 hours straight on up. But it's just a matter of pride or whatever. You know, those behavior patterns, which we don't need the feds to create, we have them going all by ourselves.
Right.
Okay, and no one really being held accountable for it either. I mean, they can step into that and just run wild with it. You know? So those techniques had already been honed by outfits like the Pinkertons that were working directly for the railroad corporations and the steel corporations and the coal corporations and so forth. You know, they're incorporated into the vernacular, tactical vernacular of the Bureau and are applied to radicals of all stripes consistently. You get this point where they say, or a period, after the Palmer raids and after the Teapot Dome scandal and stuff, and Hoover becomes director on the promise that he's going to depoliticize the Bureau. And, you know, the standard line is that he was good to his word. Well, he built the organization. Well, he never was good to his word. He had ways of running end runs through, you know, he had a relationship with military intelligence. In fact, he learned some of his techniques from Ralph Vanderman, who's the father of what they at the time called negative intelligence, you know. Hoover was a draft dodger, for God's sake, and then Vanderman gets him a commission as a reserve captain, I think, at the time, in military intelligence. He's a colonel by the time you get to World War II. Then he resigned his commission. His number two, Clyde Tolson, was in, he got his commission in naval intelligence to cover the other base. So they had feeders. They're not collecting information the way they had. They were able to retain all their radicals files, and that includes, you know, on black radicals right along, probably in Islamic radicals too, although I've never seen a classification for that at the time. Doesn't mean there isn't one. They had all the stuff they're carrying forward from that Red Scare period, but they've also got feeders from both major branches of the military intelligence, from the Army and from the Navy. Plus they've got the American Legion, which takes as a patriotic duty. And there's actually a formal relationship worked out where every Legion post in the country is reporting on supposed subversive activities, all through this period where the FBI is supposedly not engaged in political intelligence activities and repression. Now, coming out of the Red Scare, obviously, Garvey's organization was in pretty thorough disarray. Okay. Both the Communist Party and the Communist Labor Party, the two wings were formed in 1919, have been driven, one of them underground, leadership into exile or into prison, their membership's through the floor. You got the Roaring Twenties going on. There's some prosperity happening, so the danger of being a member of it is pretty apparent, and the advantage to being a member of it is less apparent than it would be at other periods, like in the 1930s. So you've got a sort of low ebb of American radicalism going on during this period. It's not gone away, okay, but there's not a great need for the types of repression we're talking about in order to maintain the status quo. The status quo destabilizes itself through financial manipulations on Wall Street, which are incidentally not responded to the way Garvey's transgressions were by any stretch. You know, a big offender in that was a guy by the name of Joe Kennedy, who was the father of John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, okay, who was both manipulating the stock market in a big time way, but generating capital to further his manipulations by going in league with bootleggers like Waxy Gordon, you know, during Prohibition. So he's mobbed up, you might say, and a major manipulator. And the penalty for him was he was drafted essentially to write the rules for regulating stock markets, so nobody could do what he had already done. You know, got to keep the money, and then they sent him over to be the first Irish-born or Irish-descended ambassador of the United States to the court of St. James. So he's an ambassador to England in the 30s. That's a little different than what they did with Garvey. The disparity is clear. Okay, but you know, that's another thing. You can see that line continue right up to the present moment.
Right.
Okay. You could ask Oliver North about the trajectory of his career after he was convicted of violating all kinds of laws and peddling cocaine. It's tied in with that. And they got him on. His community service was supposed to be down working in cocaine diversion and rehabilitation projects because he had been involved in peddling it as a government official, and he ends up being what? Grand Patriot with his own program on right-wing TV. Yeah. Yeah. You put that one up against cases Sekou and Dinga.
Yeah.
You know?
Some of those, one of the things you were talking about, rumor and infiltration. I was listening to a conversation of Daruba bin Wahad, and he was talking about how the Panther case of domestic terrorism was kind of built on, like, different agents would be taking reports and they wouldn't know that they're recording what the other agent is talking about in terms of blowing up things. So they recorded that as a Panther saying that. So could you tell me a little bit about, or tell our viewers basically a little bit about these kinds of mechanisms that the feds and other organizations of the government engage in, where they're sometimes actually recording each other, but they don't even know, but a case is being built against the...
Or they say they don't know. Or
yeah,
they say.
Exactly. Yeah.
And actually, that often works because you've got these collaborative relations. In New York, it was the Bureau of Strategic Services, as they called it. I've heard it called the Bureau of Special Services too, but I think it's Strategic Services is the actual name, BOSS. And that's the Red Squad, essentially. That's, when you're talking about New York Police Department having operations, you're talking about major stuff. It's not 6 guys with a file cabinet, you know, looking at a few radicals, you're talking about a major operation here.
Mhm.
Boss and FBI, the COINTELPRO end of things with regard to black radicals in general, and Panthers in particular, had a collaborative relationship, but they each suspected the other, and they're both, you know, I don't know if glory hounds is exactly the way to put it, because a lot of the stuff they did not want to make public, but within the profession, you know, who gets credit for what. And there's ego and status tied up in that. So they did not always share information. They were not totally forthcoming, you could say. You know, it was on a sort of a need to know basis, and they knew they had common objectives. It was a question of who's going to get credit for them. They had common targets and blah, blah, blah. All right. So it may well be that Drew is right in a sense that you got an FBI wiretap, and you've got somebody that was infiltrated by Boss and the Black Panther Party making statements. And the FBI genuinely did not know that this was an infiltrator at the time they made the wiretap. But by the time you go to court, this had better be clear. Okay. Except they're not going to be too worried about it, because that's a political trial, and the object of political trial is to neutralize people by putting them away. Even beyond what you've already done by charging them with all manner of ridiculous stuff, like going to blow up the Bronx Botanical Garden using 3 spray cans. The empty spray cans were evidence introduced, and this was a bomb-making material, and they're going to use spray cans full of black powder or something to blow up the botanical gardens. You know, it's absurd on its face.
Ridiculous.
But they've got everybody tied down on $125,000 each bail because they're dangerous terrorists. Okay. For a year and a half. Now, you've already accomplished, by the time the trial's over, you've already accomplished your objective, because New York Panthers had mutated, you could say, under the pressure to a considerable extent as a result of having the entire leadership tied up and money going into that. They finally raised enough money to get 2-3 people out of prison. One of them was Guru, because he was a good speaker, you know. And they figured it was to everybody's advantage to have him on the street, because he could speak a lot better than some of his co-defendants. You know, but there's $300,000 in change, or coming on $400,000 tied up in that. Well, in those days, that was an astronomical amount of money that would have been gone into community organizing and developing projects and so forth. Plus, you would have had your best people on the street coordinating activities and so on and so on. Well, all that went away just on the basis of the trial. Now, if they'd gotten convictions out of it, so much the better, but the convictions are almost an afterthought at this point. That's sort of the tactic that I was talking about being used in '67 against Ram, written on a grand scale. Right? And they were trying to frame them in the whole shot. You know, this was clear. And all kinds of extraneous charges. But at the end of that, I think it took them an hour. The jury went out, and they had 244 separate charges. But, you know, because you got the same charge lodged against each defendant. It took them an hour, and they found them not guilty on all charges. It was just a sweep. So, you know, transparent repression was going on there. But that had a lot to do with the direction taken by New York Panthers in the aftermath of the trial. And that leads you into the nature of the Black Liberation Army stuff that was happening as a result of the case of Assata Shakur and so on. So you can, you know, there's genealogies to these things. They don't just happen out of the blue. Anyway, yeah, Drew was probably right to some extent, and probably wrong to some extent, because, you know, if they're not going to disclose the identity or even the existence of an infiltrator, then they can treat that infiltrator's commentary as if it's legitimate commentary in full knowledge that they're doing it. And like any good sociopath, they got no particular qualms about doing that.
Nice.
You know, you look at the stuff that's going on in New York now with review of cases, and far less prominent targets than this, just systematically presenting false evidence with, you know, prosecutors knowing it, detectives are fabricating it. That what was the guy's name, DeBrascio or something? There's a now retired detective that, you know, there were something like 56 cases that were under review of people subject being released because he fabricated evidence, and there's clear indications that the prosecutor's office and the individual prosecutors specifically knew what was false in the case they were presenting, and presented it anyway and sent people away for life. And there's just, in order to run up statistics and send some kind of message, I'm not even sure what the message specifically was intended to be, other than, you know, we can do it. We're doing it because we can. What are you going to do about it? Good question, because the detective hasn't been brought up on any kind of charges. He just keeps insisting that none of it's true, you know, his entire career. And he's just a flagrant example, and more flagrant than lots and lots of others. And you look what happened with the Central Park 5 case. Take another. Okay, and they do this stuff as a matter of course. So now when you got a political incentive, the idea that a prosecutor would be knowingly presenting completely fabricated evidence in order to obtain a conviction of a target, and then a federal judge would go along with it. You know, that would not be exactly unheard of either. Right. So, you know, you got that American Indian movement with the Peltier case. Right. Very clear record. The agents were completely contradicting what they said in an earlier trial under oath, but you could not bring that earlier trial record to bear in cross-examining them, so they could just lie their ass off. That federal judge, Benson, was fully aware of it, was meeting ex parte with the federal prosecutors and Justice Department officials, and the FBI for that matter, in chambers to work it all out. So that's the thing with the status quo. You get vested interests, people who see their interests as being aligned with the system as is. Okay. They're going to be proactively engaged in rigging things to accomplish the purposes. Yeah.
What is all this, and specifically from your, you know, work with dealing with these documents, what does it tell us about, you know, about the white power structure, how they see threats, and what they see as threats and how they respond to them? I know you've kind of already been going over this a bit, but specifically for younger people who are, you know, trying to organize themselves, trying to organize their community, or just trying to organize for some type of change, what do they need to know with regard to, you know, like what these documents show us about, you know, how the power structure deals with threats, what they see as most threatening, and yeah, just what should our, you know, what are the things we need to keep in mind? What should our attitude be towards the opposition that we're bound to face if we become effective?
Well, there's several things. One is, I'll just start with what old man told me. Old guy by the name of Matthew King in Pine Ridge. And the way he put it was, if you don't know your history, you don't know where you are. I mean, you get some snapshot view of circumstances and you think you understand it, but if you don't understand the history of how you got to this point, you really don't know where you are. And if you don't know where you are, you cannot figure out how you need to move in order to get where you think you want to go. Okay? Those pieces are inseparable. The present is defined by the past. Okay? And the future is going to be defined by the actions, decisions, and so forth taken in the present. So that's a broad thing. You need to really pay attention to this. You're probably not going to get it in sound bites and stuff. The easy way. You're going to have to actually look. So people put a whole lot of work into pulling that history out, put coherent form so it's accessible. You need to treat that seriously. So that's part one. But drawing on experience, and what I see going on now is, well, we used to have a bumper sticker that said, never take a paradigm for granted. Okay. So there's not a pill or a panacea. All right. I'm not a pacifist. Okay. I endorse the right to armed self-defense. I endorse the right to armed struggle. Picking up a gun is not the solution. It's not automatic. So somebody that comes along like that guy at the Republican convention telling you the only way to make point was to firebomb some absurd location like a precinct police station or something. He'd earlier been with Common Ground in actually, he's across the river from New Orleans. He's over in Algiers. All right. Brendan, whatever his name was, who later even said instead of being an activist, he should have been in therapy. But basically, he's working for the FBI. But he had the militant rap. And actually, you know, there was a distinction to be drawn between the two contexts. When he was in Algiers, he was working with Malik Rahim. Malik Rahim is history in that sense. I mean, he knew the struggle. He's an old guy. He had been at it since he was younger than Brendan and so forth. Understood the place armed struggle would take in community self-defense there, and basically kept the rope around the guy who was very effective in bringing in weapons. But that may have something to do with the fact that he was working for the FBI even then. Okay. He got his creds there, and he had this militant line. And when he went to Minneapolis for a Republican convention and ran his rap, he's running it on some kids that are younger than him who are looking at him like, okay, this is Mr. Armed Struggle here, automatically credible. And no, it's not that simple. And if you don't know somebody, okay, a little caution is the first rule. Because if the gorilla doesn't survive, the gorilla does not win. So you've got to keep your wits about you. And so that may be tying up with people who have some history in the movement so that you can learn the moves and the history from them so that there's this intergenerational continuity. There may not be an ability in part of some of those people to do the sorts of things you're talking about because they're getting on in years and they can't do what they did when they were 25 anymore. But they can give you some concrete grounding on how to make your moves that you can still make. See? Incidentally, I said that about myself. I've been active for over 50 years, and I'd say probably 95% of all the activity I've been engaged in would qualify by any reasonable definition as nonviolent. I've participated in armed struggle at points and always supported those who do, other contexts for reasons which I'm not going to challenge. I'm not in that particular context, right? But they're automatically worthy of my support. They're not going to be shunned. And we got this sort of tyranny of nonviolence going on now that discredits anybody that steps out, but that in a way exotifies provocateurs who would provide an alternative in certain contexts, and that's a setup. So there's something to learn there. Somebody who is bringing too many resources to bear, including, as was done in Common Ground, the guy bringing in the weapons. These are no longer inexpensive devices.
Right.
This guy has a visible means of employment.
Right.
How is he getting all this stuff? Okay, this has been repetition since 9/11. People who, a provocateur will come in and provide them with timers and explosives. Often they're dummy explosives, but nonetheless, nobody ever seems to think about posing the question of where, okay, not only his sources, but how in the hell is he financing this?
Right.
Yeah? Asking intelligent questions. Think before you move. Okay? And, movements can only succeed when they are sitting on the basis of mutual respect between organizations. If anybody had the proper formula for social transformation in a constructive fashion, it would have been transformed already. So this is a process of trying to find it. And that takes me back to the eternal debates about proper understanding of the dialectic from people who don't know a dialectic from dialogue. Okay? There's not an ideological prescription, ideological infighting, takes us back to the 1920s. Low point for the FBI in terms of visible political activity was because the left was so busy bickering with itself that there was really nobody to repress. We repress ourselves in this nonsense.
Yeah, we had actually someone from the audience that was asking about, navigating hostility and conflict within, coalitions or within organizations. Because there's so much potential there, right? So, are there any kind of principles or practices with regards to mitigating conflicts that you see are really effective, or just an attitude or approach to those conflicts?
Well, it's a couple of popular sort of in vogue vernacular, cancel culture. A lot of time trying to cancel one another out. You get he's a sexist. I spend a lot of time going from place to place and talking with groups, over the years. And an example of this that has always stuck with me because it was so outrageous. So I got into Portland, worked with the Portland anarchist community there for several years. And I hit town one day, and the buzz was a guy whose name I knew, but I don't think I'd ever even met him at the time, was being essentially exiled from the entire scene on the basis of being a rapist. So a women's collective accused him of being a rapist. But the older John Zerzan and a couple of others sort of sat down with that and very calmly talked through this. This doesn't sound right. Known him for a long time. Never known him to be that way, And he said, what exactly is it that he did? And pretty much in this kind of a tone, not a shouting match, all right? And they worked it around, and finally it came out. He eats meat. Eating meat was analogous in their, theoretical construct to rape. He ate meat, and therefore he was a rapist. They didn't explain it. They just made the accusation. So be careful in accusations. Everybody's a cop. Everybody is. sexist. Everybody is, and there's a basis to it sometimes. One censors want to be up, but one also wants to be filtering information and sitting down and going through in a calm way. All right, you're saying this is true. What are you basing that on?
Mm-hmm.
What evidence do you have of that?
Right.
Oh, your suspicion, or was outside smoking a cigarette, and we don't smoke cigarettes in our pure environment. Or I actually had that one too, at an anarchist convention, saying a conference that they had. Was this important? Somewhere in Eugene, I think. In any case, I'm talking to a collective from Portland. And their question was, how do we sit around talking all the time with the same people. Mm-hmm. All right, it's kind of like watching The Usual Suspects. So how do we get working people and such to actually even talk to us? So, well, Portland just passed a no smoking ordinance. That's what my hook was there. Okay. So all of a sudden, these working people you're talking about got their neighborhood bar, which they cannot go in to socialize and stuff. They're very upset about it. And I had just come from Colorado where the same process is going on. So this is a calculated guess on my part. But yeah, they acknowledge that. All right. Yeah, they're really upset about it. There's all kinds. Too bad you can't get them that inspired to make a ruckus over something substantial. You don't tell them what's substantial. Missionaries do that. You need to be paying attention to what they consider substantial. Meet them where they are, and then you got some ground to work it into something else. So you want them to talk to you? Go down. If they picketed in some place about this, making a protest, go join the protest and support it. And the woman who was nominally the head person in this anti-authoritarian group looks at me kind of stricken and says, well, I agree with that law. Oh, well, that's why they won't talk to you, because you have no problem with having your preferences and priorities enforced by the state, you anti-statist, so long as it's something you agree with. Come on, think about this. And she never would come around. She stuck to her guns. Well, that's appropriate. Nobody ever told you had to go into that bar to hang out and socialize. You don't like that environment, don't go there. But don't impose your environment on other people in places you'll never be. Take them for where they are. A little mutual respect, even if you think they're wrong. Okay. In the interaction, you can pull this out. And who knows, they might even persuade you in the end. Not to become a smoker, okay, but unlax and maybe get on to something that's more consequential in the broader scheme of things, rather than, coming off like some Calvinist preacher dictating the moral standards by which they should abide.
Yeah, this is something actually we see a lot of nowadays from all these various angles, and it's like, depending on your demographic and your perspective, there's like 15-20 different lines of thinking that says, well, I can't work with you because you like you like French fries, or you like this thing that you pick the different things that people choose to write people off and say, well, they do this. And one of the things for us with milestones is, we have a sense of purpose, we have a sense of mission, we have a perspective, we have a set of values, which is Islam, etc. But our focus is that wherever people are oppressed, there's going to be struggles that come up, and we as Muslims have an obligation to be involved with the struggles against oppression and injustice. So we have to find ways to connect with people that are being oppressed. We have to find ways to connect with the people that are at the bottom of society, and you know, be a sincere ally, whether, you know, whether they look like us or if they don't look like us, you know, whether if they speak like us or they don't speak like us, you know. And ultimately through the process of struggle, we'll find ourselves closer and closer together and more like one people, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. That's where I'm going with this.
Can I ask you a question
That
about
solidarity? Just let me say this.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Solidarity, in a sense that it's not just a buzzword.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, is the first level major defense line. If you're not already trying to one up, you know, all this bickering, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
In the name of solidarity, wars in solidarity with somebody somewhere, but somehow that solidarity ends up being with the people of El Salvador, or, you know, I'm in favor of being in solidarity with the people of El Salvador and Southeast Asia, South Africa, wherever. But how about solidarity with people right here?
Mm-hmm.
Now, how about solidarity with one another?
Mm-hmm.
That in concert with engaging your critical intellect, your critical facilities, you know, thinking through things before you do them, asking for proof, not engaging in rumor mongering yourself. These sorts of things, you know, behavioral things, but mostly critical engagement. That's where our defense is. That's why thinking is the most outlawed activity, most prohibited activity, most frowned upon activity in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Period. If you think about things for 5 minutes, you can't go along them. If you actually think about them rather than just regurgitate sound bites and don't let somebody else do your thinking for you.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
You're gonna find yourself in a conflict.
Oh yeah. You know, but you know, I said there's not a pill you can take to combat weather. People tried that when they became Weather Underground.
Right. Was it like LSD? They were experimenting
LSD and sit around and do crit self-crit.
Yeah.
All right. You know who came through that in flying colors? You had people that were just crumbled as a result of that and fell out of the movement altogether because they were psychologically damaged by the experience. I mean, really traumatized. The one who sailed through it flying colors is a guy by the name of Larry Grathwohl, who was the federal infiltrator.
So he passed their test.
Yeah, he passed the acid test. Yeah. We'll figure. So, you know, all these shortcuts and recipes, and not one of them work. If they worked, you know, you know, your critical intellect might tell you somebody else, generation or two, might have thought something similar and tried it, and if it worked, you wouldn't be sitting here trying to think up a recipe now.
Right.
So maybe we want to explore the history of that a little bit. You know, and some of this learned the hard way. LSD was advocated by Abby Hoffman and a bunch of others, you know, as a revolutionary consciousness raising breakthrough sort of experience. And actually, I think John Sinclair is probably more right than wrong about that, because LSD was a drug being used for experimental purposes by the CIA in the late 50s and early 60s. And probably that's the principal source until Owsley learned to manufacture it himself. I don't know enough about Owsley. I don't know of any government connections on the guy. So he was manufacturing the pharmaceutical, but the source of that was psychological weapon, chemical warfare. The Army and most definitely CIA were experimenting with the whole Manchurian candidate idea that they had, MK Ultra. So they didn't have to. They didn't have to drug anybody. We were drugging ourselves. And I had my brief period of being bought into that too. Didn't take me too awful long to get past it though, because it never did me any good. Some people seem to thrive on it. And they probably weren't all federal operatives.
Right.
Grathwell is just an example. Just when you think you got a prescription, there's an easy way to do this stuff. There's not.
Right.
No. It's struggle and it's work.
Tanzine, did you have you still have
Yeah.
more questions? Because
I
we got at least one from the audience, and just check.
I have like
about a 1 minute break here before we get to it.
Yes, please do.
Yeah. Go ahead. Go for it. So this break will be a great time for us to remind anyone who's listening about the fundraiser. So I believe right now it's still up, but we're going to be taking this one down in the next day or so, I believe, because of LaunchGood is changing some things about their platform. So we're going to be ending this current link campaign that we have, and we're going to relaunch it immediately with the new processor that LaunchGood is using. So we're still going to be fundraising because we haven't met our goal yet, but we're going to be taking down the link. We're going to be taking down the link that's up, and we're going to be putting up a new link as well. The other thing is we're still going back and forth with scheduling a couple of guest panelists. So we're in the midst of trying to confirm and make that concrete. But I can tell you that next Saturday, what we're going to be doing is we're going to take a closer look at some of Russell Maroon Schultz's writing. And we're going to be, because, his writing actually has a lot of detail and history that we feel is really relevant for what we want to cover in this series. And initially, I was actually worried about not getting enough time to go over some of that stuff. So alhamdulillah, with the scheduling struggles that we've been having, it's going to give us a bit more time to get into that. So next Saturday, we're going to be doing another reading of one of Russell Schultz's article, and this one is called The Dragon and the Hydra. So just a quick announcement for everybody.
Yeah, and also to remind the audience that we sent PDFs for those of you who are registered of both the Dragon and the Hydra, and also the question of violence, which I will discuss along with Hannibal next week. And the other thing is next Saturday, our episode is going to start an hour and a half early. So instead of 10 a.m. Pacific time, we'll start at 8:30 because we have an organized meeting a little bit later. So we have to attend that. So in order to make room for that, we're going to be a little bit early. So just keep an eye on that. We're going to remind you again through our emails and Facebook page. But okay, Ward is back. So I want to ask Ward a bit of a technical question. There's a portion in your text. So a two-part question. Let me just ask both of them at the same time. They're connected, but not directly probably. One is the question of when you were explaining all of these different forms of repression and the tactics and so on. It seems to kind of go hand in hand with this ideology that the entire apparatus pushes for pacifism, right? So the movement has largely, and it kind of talked about also this difference between separatism. Most of them seem to be more militant versus this kind of integrationist approach, which tends to pick up on pacifism. And you wrote a whole essay, a text on pacifism as pathology. So there is a connection, it seems like, between the government repressing militancy and any kind of potential effective movement and struggle and approach. And on the other hand, there is this like ideological kind of push to go with pacifism. So if you could kind of discuss that connection. That's question number one. And number two is a little bit more technical. In COINTELPRO papers, there's an entire chapter on deletions, that how deletion, to delete stuff that from the documents, that the government has a specific way, reason why they delete things, even when things are made public, a huge part of it will be deleted or taken out for the sake of national security or something like this. So if we could discuss that kind of loopholes and things like that that the government uses to keep things secret for a very long time, even after they're kind of out in the open, there are parts that are missing. So if you could discuss that and the first question on pacifism.
Okay, let me take the last part first because that's more straightforward.
Sure.
They're entitled under the Freedom of Information Act to delete passages or withhold documents sometimes, depends how it's framed, that would disclose intelligence gathering methods, okay? Or law enforcement methods, but it's more intelligence gathering what they're interested in. Well, and they do the interpreting of what would do that. So you have these people that sit and respond, take the files and respond to an FOIA request and go through it page by page. They do this each time, unless the entire file is declassified, in which case, you know, somebody or some bodies go through that file, and that's going to be the file that's the release file. But when you're doing an individual request, they respond to each individual request, court disclosure or FOIA request or whatever, okay? So aside from methods, names of informants are always by definition, in the way the FBI and the other intelligence agencies, as far as I know, deal with it. Informant identities are always protected, but they also protect the privacy of individuals other than the requesting party. So if you come upon a paragraph where they're talking about you met with a group of people, your name will appear in the document and everybody else's name is deleted. But they also extend that to the names of police personnel and their own agents. Excuse me.
Yeah.
I won't comment any further on that. And there's several other lesser things. Those are the ones that are invoked over and over again. So you get an FBI document, every now and again, there's one that's just relatively clean. They're talking about you. End of story. They don't name agents other than perhaps whoever did the submission, and there'll be a little, you know, that's blacked out. They've gotten more technically sophisticated, so every now and again it's whited out with that, you know, IBM's electric typewriter tape, you know, the deletion tape. So it's either blacked out, and that's in pink marker, so that can be reviewed. That file can be reviewed by somebody that's over the deleting person. They can still see what's there, but when you do a Xerox copy of it, it's going to come out. It's just a black highlight line. So it'll either be blacked out that way or whited out. All right. But basically, the kind of information I'm talking about is eliminated page by page by page. And sometimes they can withhold documents, but sometimes they don't. They release the document. It's got a caption heading, and the entire rest of the document may be blacked out line by line by line by line. So you just got one black line after another, and then usually the dissemination keys at the end. You can still get some information off that because there's code numbers of what type of investigation it is and so forth, you know, and serialization numbers so you can tell a sequence in the file you're looking at. All right. So they're not entirely useless, but basically mostly useless. But some of us have done this for a while, because there was a lot of disclosure in FOIA requests in the 1970s.
Mhm.
So I could get Geronimo Pratt's,
Mhm.
the discovery files.
Mhm.
And I mean, we're talking 170,000 odd pages of paper, a lot of which is duplicated.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
But Jonathan Lubell, who handled that aspect of his case, just gave me a room with a Xerox machine and an ashtray and all these boxes stacked up against the wall. You know, you go for it. And I spent 3 weeks going through it. People's law office in Chicago did pretty much the same thing. But what I started to find out was a lot of these documents pertain to more than one individual.
Mhm.
And there's been discovery made in like the New York Three. Okay, and that has an overlap because it's part of New Kill, as they captioned that case. Overlaps with derivatives files, overlaps with several other Panther files, each of whom was prosecuted for something or another. Okay, at various times after that, all of them did discovery. You can take the file paper, same document, on 4 different files, and it's going to be a different deletion pattern. So you can reconstruct documents, at least in part, from what it is that's deleted in one version of the document will not be deleted in the next. And you can construct a list of names, and you can, cumulatively, you can infer who some of the informants are, who some of the agents were, and so on. So, like I say, it's work. It's time consuming. It can be fascinating, but a lot of this is just laborious. And you keep running into the, resident agencies in particular. Oh, sometimes you find this with the field offices too. They'll send in a 2-page document referring to some investigation of a local activist they're doing, and then they'll attach description of, I was just looking at they attached to the boilerplate description. There was like an FBI synopsis, organizational synopsis of Students for Democratic Society, Progressive Labor Party, Black Panther Party. So the 2-page document ends up being about that thick, and it's all boilerplate, So if I tell you I've got a 900-page FBI file in my filing cabinet in there, don't necessarily be impressed, because I've got the summary on Students for Democratic Society and so on, umpteen times as attachments in that. And that works with the 170,000 odd pages of Pratt too. My God, there was a time when I thought Kathleen Cleaver's first name was actually Cumley, because some agent in the LA office decided Kathleen was good looking, and so they referred to her as the Cumley Kathleen Cleaver.
Oh, wow.
And then, there was a time when I thought my first name was Embattled, as in the embattled professor. That was back during the great controversy, but some journalists use it, and then every journalist uses it. Everything I read in the paper about myself referred to me as the embattled professor. Well, in the FBI files, she is always the Cumley Kathleen Cleaver after about 1970. Just they all use that. Little ticks and quirks like that. So, okay. Is there more you wanted to know with regard to deletions?
No, that's great. That's great. Actually, it's a lot of information.
When they withhold when they do that too, they'll always put a code up, 15C, okay, and that tells you what specific deletion, exemption they're relying upon in order to make the deletion. When they do a whole document, they're supposed to insert a sheet. It's a form that spells out the basis, upon which they're withholding a document, or how many pages are involved, how many documents, and there's a skip in the serialization. All right. Then that's it.
Yeah.
With deletion.
Yeah.
With the pacifism and
Yeah.
so on.
Exactly.
Well, we got a little bit of semantic problem here in a way, because a lot of what comes under the heading, and I've been seeing this with Portland a lot, and in the internal federal papers, insofar as reported. I have not seen the internal documents, but they get quoted in the press. And see, to me, breaking a window at Starbucks the way they did in Seattle, in the G7 or G whatever, okay, big Seattle set to with the police and all that. And the anarchists are running around breaking the windows at Starbucks, and this is indication of the violence. That's not violence.
Right.
Okay. Having a flat tire, that's not violence either.
Right.
All right, let's get real. Violence is maybe would cover clubbing somebody over the head with a steel tip baton, for example, but I don't hear anybody talk about the violence of clone police, even now. Okay. You're seeing that start to creep in now under extreme pressure when it's so glaringly obvious. They keep talking about violent protesters in Portland, and that federal list of things that indicate the level of violence that were being responded to. All but one thing. They had I think it was 15 different examples of the offensive actions of the protesters were listed. And of the 15, 14 were graffiti. Now, graffiti is violence. Yeah. So anything that's disorderly gets construed as violence. And frankly, it's being done or interpreted that way by a lot of our own folks. I could almost say the feds are taking it up from the pledge of nonviolence people, stepping off the goddamn, sidewalk into the street.
Yeah.
When the permits said you had to remain on the sidewalk, it's disorderly and sort of cast as, okay, that was a kind of a violent action. So the protest ends up being essentially the activity of a bunch of self-hurting sheep that lead themselves down the sidewalk or wherever it is they're told they're permitted to walk into free speech pin. They actually put fences up around this thing safely out of sight and mind of anybody they're supposed to be speaking truth to. So always talking about speaking truth to power. Well, power ain't listening. Power knows all about it. You got nothing to tell about what's wrong with it. They already know that, and they're doing it anyway. And now you're over here talking to yourselves. Geez, if you want to masturbate, go home. Enjoy yourself, but don't do it in public and call it politics, because that's really what this comes down to. And the rule of thumb, bad term given its origin. See, I know my etymology as well, but the rule that's applied is that if the state sanctions it, it's not probably bothering the state one damn bit. In fact, it forces the liberal image of a decidedly anti-liberal state. Okay.
Yeah,
you can in the continuation of business as usual.
A couple of years ago, Ruthie Gilmore was here, and she gave a talk. I think the title of it was like "Life in Hell: Capitalism, Saving Capitalism from Capitalism," something to that nature. But she made this argument about the anti-state state. And she was making this argument about how there's all of these efforts to create, like vehicles and spaces where it's meant to be considered or thought of as resistance, but ultimately is reinforcing the agenda of the state in some way, in some like subtle, sophisticated kind of way, where it's like, okay, we're speaking truth to power, but the way that we speak truth to power is undermining some grassroots thing, or the way that we gather is exclusionary for people who might actually change something, right? And so then you generate these spaces where it's all assumed that you're resisting against the status quo, but ultimately in some way it's propping up the status quo and reinforcing it.
Yeah. They'll give you a police escort, give you a brass band, requested in all probability. All right, anything, so long as you're not disrupting anything. Right. So you don't speak truth to power in any case, in the sense that you make a speech or an argument.
Right.
All right, you speak truth to people. When you get into free speech, and the only truth to people is you just rendered yourselves irrelevant. Now they're not going to ask you back to speak.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now you just communicate to the polite community of we're going to feel good about ourselves because we went out and bore witness.
Yeah.
Now, Garuba made a good point on Mr. Grant, that you had people who stood there and recorded the entire lynching. And that's the evidence that it happened, and it's the evidence that will be used against the cop. Okay? But Garuba pointed out that if just one person had picked up a bottle, a rock, a brick, or something and thrown it hard at that cop, the guy'd still be alive.
That's right.
That's
right.
And I'm glad they
even if they stepped off the sidewalk, even if two people had stepped off of the sidewalk, it would have changed the dynamic. Because you see these type of situations a lot.
Right.
At least me personally, right? Like growing up in ghetto environments, you see police constantly are harassing somebody, they're searching somebody or something, right? And you can see almost like clockwork, anytime you like approach them, you move closer to them, a crowd gathers or anything like that, once they feel a little bit of pressure, they're gonna take that person and put them in the car. They're gonna put the handcuffs on him and put him in the car. But at least that would have, he'd been getting arrested, right? But at least they would have pulled him up off the ground.
Right.
And we know they would have done that, and all the people really had to do was step off the curb, like, hey, leave him alone,
Yeah, I don't understand the ultimate logic. Okay.
Right.
If I come upon a murdering process, if I have any means of doing it, I'm going to intervene to prevent that. I'm obligated to.
Right.
Okay. Same with the mugging, same with the rape. Stand there bearing witness to it.
Right.
Okay. Accomplishes nothing other than perhaps it empowers the state to make a prosecution, which they'll do under right circumstances. Okay. Again, the liberal veneer. And so these cops are being prosecuted, and they should be within that frame, but is that our frame? To reinforce the state that we supposedly oppose, at least in part? Oh, we're going to transform it into the opposite of itself? Good luck with that.
Right.
The alchemists were trying that with converting lead into gold or something once upon a time. I don't care how many times you repeat that incantation and vary the formula a little bit, you're still not getting the desired result. So, I thought perhaps we got a little further than that, but no. And I think the reason we don't is it's a lot safer, a lot more comfortable to purport to be doing something that you're ultimately not, but that allows you to pretend that you did and feel good about yourself. And I think maybe you feel good about yourself once you win. Okay. Maybe you had not feel good about yourself until you do.
Right.
You have a reason to feel bad about yourself. Well, when the circumstances change in this context, then you got a reason to let go of that. Perhaps you help transform it into something positive.
Right.
But the proof is in the pudding, in the results, not in the performance. And what we're doing is a kind of performance art here.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Right?
The other thing, have you
I will
seen
say this is a cautionary note. If you're serious about the sort of stuff I'm saying and stepping out of that particular box, don't take your children and your old people to it. All right.
Right.
Little kids got no place, and it will be a violent context.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
You seriously confront what they're putting up now for crowd control and stuff. There's going to be serious violence.
Yeah.
You know, you don't want your 4-year-old there, and you don't want your 84-year-old grandmother there either.
Mm-hmm.
If Granny wants to go, I guess you can't stop her, but don't take her.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
That's real.
we talk about the state being this horrendously violent thing, and then go out and treat it like it's, well, they even call it that sometimes, a festival.
Yeah.
Did that in Chicago during Democratic Convention in '68, as I recall. It was to be a festival of life. Yeah, how'd that work out for you? And people still doing that, you know. So you were starting to ask me something, Tansy, before I went running off the mouth again.
No, I mean, I just wanted to give an example of what Hannibal said. Like a few weeks ago, there was this white lawyer. I don't know if they're couples, but they came out with their guns. There were hundreds of protesters, and it was clear that, especially the white woman, the way she was holding the gun, she never used it. Like you could see that and they could have easily rushed them. I simply did not understand, like doing a protest and you had hundreds of people and there was these 2 people who just seemed afraid. And I didn't understand the logic of only taking pictures and trying to shame them or something. And that became like a protest move. That was really strange to me, that why they didn't just get taken care of by the
Talking about
crowd.
that couple in St. Louis?
I think it was St. Louis, yeah. They were outside of they came outside of the law office or something, and they had their guns, and they were like, threatening. It was weird. It was 2 people.
I don't want to jolt you here, but get a grip on the edge of the table. That formal looking building, that was their house.
Oh, wow.
Right.
This was not a mom and pop shop operation.
Right.
Okay.
Right. That property,
St. Louis,
that property right there. That was in the state right
really
there.
Mm-hmm. And they're not being prosecuted either.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
To kind of piggyback too, in one of our previous episodes, we talked about one of Russell Schultz's articles, Black Fighting Formations. And he specifically talks about how a lot of groups got caught in this spectacle, utilizing somewhat militant tactics and strategies while still relying on this holdover from the civil rights movement, which was the idea that you're going to rely on the sort of moral pressure of the world, and you're going to rely on the sort of moral outlook of the world by putting attention and focus onto, by drawing all this attention to these battles, right? And by bringing all this attention on everything you do, then when the police beat you up or racists target you, etc., then the idea is that, the world would defend you and they'd be ashamed and there'd be some kind of power, or there'd be something negotiable there. But that proved disastrous for a lot of people, because ultimately they put all this attention and pressure on themselves and their organizations, while there's no morality on the part of the oppressors that you can try to persuade them morally, and ultimately there's very little value in shaming them before the world, because
Mm-hmm.
it's like if people are not going to take up the actions alongside you, then ultimately that shame doesn't have much value. And
Mm-hmm.
so we still see that hold over today, where
Right.
this idea or this sort of obsession about catching it on video.
Right.
If we catch them on video,
Mm-hmm.
we'll finally have the proof to bring
Right.
to this morally bankrupt power structure, right?
Right.
Like we'll have the evidence to take to the judge that, we can take this to this racist judge to prove to the racist judge that the police are racist. And it's like,
Right.
this backwards kind of logic. Or, we're going to videotape this, and then if the world sees it, then something's going
Right.
to change. Something's going to happen if
Right.
the world sees how, corrupt these people are.
It's the
You know,
continuation of the sit-ins, basically, in a way, like drawing attention to something and thinking that that's going to, as if people don't know already that the police do what they do and they have a particular function and that's why they do what they do, So, and Malcolm was highly critical of those kinds of sit-ins to get attention. Like political action should not just be about attention that, hey, look, they're violent. That's crazy to me. Like you have to respond to that violence and make sure you deter that. I mean, that should be step one. That's not even really anything big. That should be like the first step.
Yeah.
But yeah, interesting.
well, as I recall, there was a videotape of those cops beating Rodney Grant or Rodney
King. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, King.
Right.
And you had the radio traffic about gorillas in the mist and all that, so couldn't have been recorded any more clearly what was going on, and the jury acquitted all of them. And they interviewed the woman on the jury. It was one of the women. I don't think she was the only woman on that jury, but then talking to this woman afterwards, and she said it was clear from the tape that King was controlling the whole thing because he kept moving.
Yeah.
He kept moving.
Yeah.
As long as he was moving, they had a right to continue to beat him. Well, it's been a while since that happened. And this cop Shaven is now charged with murder, and he may well go to prison for it. And so what? Doesn't change the structure that allowed him to be there in the first place.
Exactly.
But it allows people to feel good about themselves because they accomplished something in that particular case.
And then the other thing too is that what does it do to us watching so many videos and witnessing people just be spectators? Like how does it affect young people who see these videos and they're seeing, okay, obviously something terribly wrong is happening, yet the person filming it doesn't stop filming to do something, and the other people around don't intervene.
They're bearing witness. In a literal, direct, immediate sense, that's where that notion of bearing witness plays out. You're bearing witness, and that's what your obligation is. No, your obligation goes beyond that, and now you're getting into what it is that you don't even want to discuss. When you're going along, breaking windows is violent, and graffiti is violent. My God!
Right.
You end up Homie Baba, who in that essay, if you can understand it, which is always a challenge. Any concrete action you take is by definition, it works out counter-revolutionary. The only revolutionary activity is to read lots of books and write about them. I read a lot of books and I write about them, but I don't think that's my revolutionary praxis, or at least I hope not.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, but I'm going to need to take another break here.
Well, Ward, we're actually ending today's session. We're out of time. So thank you so much for joining our panel. We're going to continue to have conversations with you. I think, Hannibal, are you going to remind our audience about next week? We're changing the time.
Yeah. So there was one question we didn't get to, and I'm sorry about that. But inshallah, we'll take a look at it and we'll try to address it in the future, inshallah. But yeah, so next Saturday, 8:30, right?
8:30. We're starting
8:30
Pacific time.
Pacific time. 8:30 Pacific time next Saturday, which is going to be 11:30 Eastern time.
Yeah.
Yes, 11:30 a.m. Eastern time, 8:30 a.m.
Pacific
Pacific time is when we're going to start the session next Saturday. We're going to be going over Russell Schultz's writing again, and we're going to dig a little bit deeper into it, and we're going to be going over two more articles, right?
Yeah, we're going to be discussing the Dragon and the Hydra, and we sent already the materials to our viewers, the registered users, and we're going to be discussing the question of violence. So that's going to be next week.
Yeah,
It's
so
going to be a little shorter session. Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to try to dig a little bit deeper, and because we had some struggles with our scheduling. Again, we're going to try to use this as an opportunity instead of a setback to dig a little deeper and give a little more context so that, when we get with some of our other guest panelists, we'll have a better appreciation collectively. Our audience and everyone will have a better appreciation, and hopefully that'll help us get more out of those sessions, inshallah. And again, about the fundraiser is up right now, but it's going to be going down in the next day or two because of some changes with the launch good site. However, because we did not meet our goal yet, we're going to be putting it back up under the new processor that LaunchGood is using, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
But we're going to be putting it up again in order to meet our goal. So inshallah, keep a lookout for it, and stay tuned. Give what you can, spread this, circulate it, think about it, discuss it with people, come with more questions for us, and inshallah help us make this actually beneficial for the community, beneficial for justice, and making some type of actual change, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you, Ward, again.
Yeah, thank you, Ward. Really appreciate having you with us. For me, just a little reminder for me, when I was a teenager, is when I started listening to Doing Time. So my father had the CD Doing Time, and he used to play that, and then I started listening to it, and I would actually listen to it over and over again. And so it's really an honor to be able to interview you and build further on the things that I learned from that, as a youngster coming up.
Thank you.
I think he's saying something, but he's muted.
Muted, yeah. Ward, you're muted. If you're saying something, you're muted, your computer. Yeah.
Okay.
You're good.
What I was saying was, it was an honor to be here. It was a good interview, and you're carrying it forward. So us old guys are appreciative of the fact when y'all step it and carry it on,
Right on.
Really.
Thank you.